Interview with Mr. Stanley Hamblin, December the 4th, 1987.
Right, well, I was born at Snoring, Great Snoring. My father, he worked on for the Perone family, and as far as I know, they're still there. But then he moved to Castle Acre. Well, now Castle Acre, I always call that my home, because that's where I was brought up and went to school. Well, there were children come to Castle Acre School from all the outlying farms and from South Acre. And there wasn't no meal, school meals them days. They'd bring their dinner in a bag on the back and a bottle of drink. They'd sit in the porches or the playgrounds and have their dinner. Winter time they was allowed in front of the fire. Well, then we left school at 14, and unless you was a bit outstanding, you'd go onto the farms. Well, Castle Acre is surrounded with 1,000-acre farms, and all them farms would employ about 14 to 20 men and boys. The labour from the village, they'd all go onto these farms, and if you got wrong on one farm, well, you'd go on to another one. That was like going over one bit of land onto another. But then I was 20 before I went on the farm. And I always remember the first week's work I done, I was muck filling all the week with two old boys, Jack Bell and Billy Bob. And on the Friday, Jack say, "How old are you, Stan?" I said, 20. "You bastard, well, Auntie," he said, "you're 21. You're plenty big enough. You've been doing the same work as me and Billy all the week, and when you go into the riding stable for your money, Brett will say to you, 'How old are you, Stan?' You tell him 21. They got ninepence. Ninepence was covered your insurance. And you give him ninepence, and he'll give you 35. Otherwise, he'll give you 25. Well, that's how it was. And on the Monday, I always remember, there was a 4-horse wagon load of maize coming from Swaffham Station. And the heaviest thing I'd ever carried was a pail of water and a shopping bag. And I used to wear a collar and a tie. Well, to wear a collar, you had to have a stud in the front and a stud in the back. I found out why the old men, they all wore neck wrappers. And right he say, when you had your dinner together, you can unload that wagon up the granary. Well, up the granary was a flight of old stairs with a handrail on the side, and maize was 18 stone a come of maize. Wheat was 16, barley 14, oats were 12. Well, the first sack I got hold on, I had straight up my back, and as I began to lift to go up the stairs, that began to slip, and that dragged this collar stud down into my windpipe, and I got nearly to the top, and I let go with one hand and grasped the rail with the other. And somebody say, "Don't you drop that, Stanley, or you'll kill me." That was Billy coming up behind me. Anyway, I got there, and I took my turn and unloaded that wagon. And when I finished, you could have wrung me out like a dishcloth. I was soaked in sweat. But anyhow, when the springtime come and the horn, you go through the summer with the horn, hazel and harvest. Jack said to me, "Where you want to go, Stanley? Are you coming along with the men? Or do you want to go with the Harvard Hoys?" I said, who are they? He said, they're now the Mindy boys. Oh, I said, oh, come along here. That's it, he said, I'll put you between me and Billy, you'll be all right. Well, we went through the Horn, and Horn, them days, you worked in a gang, and every farm had a ganger, but you called him the Lord. There was a Lord on each farm. He'd set the prices, and he'd lead the pace, how you worked, and there'd be up to 14 men in a row, a horn, and you'd be laughing and talking and pulling one another's leg. Well, you didn't know you'd been to work. But that wasn't always to be like that. They found they couldn't do nothing with these Norfolk gangs, so they split them up and had you one at a time. And the way they went about that, they held some horn matches. Well, these horn matches was only to find out how long that took you to haul 100 yards, leaving so many plants to the chain. Well, then the prices were set on that. And when you went home the next year, the fields were staked out in plots. Each man went by himself, and there'd be some a going, some a coming. You'd perhaps shoot somebody as you went past one another. And home in the gangs weren't the same again. And then, of course, you weren't allowed to go home. Not sugar beet. You weren't allowed to hoe sugar beet unless you'd had 2 or 3 year horn kale and mangles, that sort of thing. There again today, there's no hoeing required. They just weed spray the field and sow the plants singly, and all that was done away with. Well, then I remember hay time. There wasn't no hay bales, that was all loose hay. And we were hay carting, and Parker and Proctor had them South Acre farms then. Parker come there, Jack said to him, what about some beer? Yes, he said, I could buy you some beer, he said. And then when I go to Norfolk, they'll want some beer. Then I go to Gate and they'll want some beer. Well, he said, I shan't tell them. No, he said, I'll watch it, don't. So, going through that, well then harvest time, all these farms, they'd run about 2 companies, and there'd be, 10 men and boys in a company. Far at the stack, far out in the field. Then there'd be horse-rig boys, elevator drivers, holiday boys, and the boys would look to do harvest, because if they could get a harvest, that'd buy them a new suit to go back to school with. And I always remember we got finished harvest at South Acre, and Parker had a farm at Gayton. We had to go to Gayton to help them out. Well, we took all the gear. There must have been 20 horses and men, elevators, wagons. You'll never see such a sight. You'll never see a sight like that on the roads no more. We took them all to Gayton, and we were carting on land they called Greenland. And I remember while we were there was a big tank delivered. They unloaded it just in off the road, and that had to go to the top of Greenland to supply water to the sheep and cattle. And how they got it up there was a ploughing engine come with a rope under the belly. That went forward, and we pulled the rope back to the tank and hooked it up, and then he pulled the tank up to the engine, and then he went forward again. And that's how that tank got on the top of Greenland. And I always remember years later, there's a piling in a compound up there with a hut in the centre. And the foreman said to me, hey, you got a sewing and a hook, Stanley? Well, of course I have, I said. I got all them sort of tools. Well, I got a job for you, he said. Bring 'em, he said, and I'll take you tomorrow morning. Well, he took me, and when we turned off of the Massenham road to go up Massenham Heath to Greenland, he said, now I'm going to lose you. I said, no, you won't lose me up here. I said, 'cause you see that tank there? I was one helped to bring that up here. Well, he said, where hadn't you been? He said, you must have bunked all over north. Yeah, no, I took that there. Well, them days, there was tramps on the road. Gayton Union and Gressenhall Union, they'd be full of tramps, and they'd turn out the gate in the mornings, walk to Castle Acre, and they'd have a ticket to get bread and cheese. They'd call in half a shop for the bread and cheese, and then they'd walk off. I suppose some would go to Gressenhall. Anyway, I remember being on that road one morning, and there was a woman among these tramps, and when she got to us, she say, see him go there. He now asked me for a light. Well, he said, there's too much wind. He said, blow it out. He said, let's go behind the hedge under the wind. No, she said, you aren't no fool, more aren't I. The harvest time, when you'd done the harvest, then you'd come on to sugar beet. And sugar beeting, well, that's something they don't do today. That's all done away with and done with machines. But when we done it, you'd have to knock every sugar beet, and there wouldn't be a leaf allowed in the tumblers. If there was, you'd hear about it. But now today, they fill them up with a machine. There's leaves and mud. That all go, I suppose. And that's how we used to go through the sugar beeting. You'd have an old sack tied in front on you, and that'd be wet through and full of mud. And one year I remember I was on the manor farm, and Jack, he left South Acre, and he come on the manor farm. Bridget Walker, he was Lord there then, and somebody said, well, now we got two old lords together, the band will play. And so it did that harvest time. That was a very wet harvest, and you took the harvest for a price. £20, I think the price was for the harvest. You draw £5 a week, and the rest when you finished. But you'd usually get a harvest done in 3 weeks if the weather was good, but this year that was very wet. And we had a lot of throwing out and cutting undone and resharpening. Jack, he got on to Bridget, he said, we should let him more money for this extra work. You won't, he said, you took the price and that's the price that'll be. You won't get more. Oh, he said, well, if you don't ask for it, I will. That's it, he said, you take the reins out of my hands. I don't want the reins out of your hands, he said, but I want more money for this extra work we're doing. It'd be about 1935. We had that wet harvest, and one morning we just had an oranges, and the captain, he come down there on his little black mare, and he said, Walker, before you make a start, you can go all around the top hedge, throw out the first 2 rows, cut them open, lie out, then you can start carting. Well, he was just going to speak to the man on the stack. Jack walked up, he said, do all this extra work get paid for, sir? Well, he swung his little mare round, he said, King Bell, you bloody agitator, he said, I'll see you off my blasted farm when this harvest is done. You don't want to worry about that, he said, I'm looking out of that inn. And off he went. Bridget said, there you are, Jack, I told you what you'd get. What the bastard hell would you get if you didn't say something, he said. Well, about 11 o'clock, I come the captain again. He said, well, forget our little argument this morning. He said, I went home and ate a damn good breakfast after I'd seen you. He said, I shall give you another 3 shillings a man for that extra work, he said, and forget about our little argument. And so you see, if he hadn't said something, we wouldn't have got that. Well, I remember another bit about that same harvest. That had been a wet week, and the foreman, he said, will you come Sunday if that's fine? Well, Sunday morning, that was a beautiful morning, and we all met on the green to decide whether we should go or no. They decided no, they wouldn't work on a Sunday. And that didn't matter how hard up the man was, he wouldn't work on a Sunday, only for special jobs like cattle or anything like that, sheep feeding. Well, Monday morning that rained. We had to go hedging. We were hedging all along the Lynn Road. Jack said, here he come together. They'll have to think up something to tell him. He said, well, Bill, why didn't you come yesterday? Lovely day you lost. Well, that's like this day, he said. I'm on a Saturday for the chapel. I'm booked up to go out preaching every Sunday, so I couldn't let that go. Oh, he said, why didn't you come here? He said, 6 days shalt thou labour. Oh, he said, you should have been old parsons, he said. And that's how that passed over. But of course, them days, every field had to be mown round. All the laid corn would have to be mown before the binders could go in. And I didn't like, there'd be one man with a soil and one a tying. And I didn't like tying, so I went to Swaffham and I bought myself a soil, cost £1, all outfit £1. Jack, he put it together for me, and I went to mine. Of course, I opened my shoulders and I was taking a big sweep. He said, get forward, Stanley, do I'll cut you off at the ankles. Took your arm in, he said, take a smaller sweep. You'll kill yourself opening out like that. But there it was. I'd bust myself to keep up. And I will say, if them old men found you was a pulling your weight, they'd help you. But if you was what they called had one stroke, they'd just let you alone and you'd get on with it. Well, like on the thrashing, I went on the stake of thrashing. Of course, I thought I was going to lift the whole stake up with one forkful, I suppose. Well, he says, show that boy how to pick them up, he'll kill himself. Of course, that would come easy then. You just pick the shoes up like picking sardines out of a tin. And I remember, man, he said, Jack, he don't want to think he's the only engine driver about here. He said, I drove engine, Jack. Oh, here? Yes, he said. Well, that wasn't long after that the governor's belt broke. And the engine driver, he was away from the engine. Of course, the old drum went round and we all jumped off the stake. This here bloke, he jumped off the stake and all run away. Jack say, I see what sort of bastard engine driver you are. And as I say, what was hard them days, but you had time to do it, and they want to worry, there seemed to be today. And on all them farms, there'd be men, they'd specialise in different jobs. Some would be skilled ploughmen, some would be stakers and thatchers. Another man, he'd be a skilled hedger. I remember on the large farm, the hedger, that'd be his winter's work. He'd be hedging all winter, and he'd have a man along of him going in front, trimming the borders. But that man wouldn't allow to touch the hedge. Oh no, same with on the stack. You'd back the stacker up, but you wouldn't allow to put nothing on those sides to eat you. Another little thing on the large farm, I remember my old grandfather, he was a farrier major in the Life Guards. When he come out of the army and he set up his own shop, come to Norfolk, set up his own blacksmith shop, he went out on the farms a shoeing. They told him there was a horse on the large farm that never had no shoes on, and there was a gallon of beer for any man who could chew it. So when he went up there, he said to the team, "Bring you me that horse." Now he said, "You can go down to the house and fetch the beer." When he come back, the blacksmith shop door was locked up. When grandfather opened the shop door, there stood the horse with 4 shoes on. He knew exactly how to handle them. But then horses, well, in the pubs at night, people talked about horses just the same as they talk about motor cars today. If you was a good horseman, well, you'd never be out of a job, but if you had no trouble, my word, you'd hear about it, because they talk about it in the pubs. And them days, well, between 1930, you might say up till the war, 1940, well, you'd see 4-horse wagons coming through the village, carting corn swapping station. You'll never see a sight like that no more. You'll see there'd be 4-horse wagons coming up a Castle Acre street. And that's how it was right up till the war. Well, when the war broke out, now that was the difference. In the 1914 war, every able-bodied man was took off the farms, went to war. Second World War, if you was on a farm, that's where you had to stop. In fact, I volunteered. They told me to stop on the farm till I was sent for. And you was just as important as a soldier. And I went through, during the war, I went on to another farm because I got married and wanted a house. And on that farm that was only a small farm, and they had a couple of house cows. Well, I never did like cows. And the governor said to me, "Do you think you can milk them cows while we were away on holiday?" Well, yes, I think so. I thought that was easy. But that wasn't as easy as I thought it was. I went home one night, and I said to the missus, "I turned them cows out, but I know I hadn't milked them right out." "Oh," she said, "well, I'd better come along with you tomorrow, and I'll learn you." And she learned me how to milk a cow, because she'd been in the land army. That's where she learned. And years later, I was on another farm, and the farmer said to me, "Oh, I hear you can milk, Stanley." Well, I said, "I don't know what you was told that for," I said, "because I never milked only 2 cows in my life." Well, he said, "If you can milk 2, you can milk 62. Oh, I said, "Well, I never had nothing to do with machines." "No," he said, "well, in that case, you're a better man than my man," he said, "because he's a machine milker, but he can't hand milk." Oh, so he said, "Will you go in the cow house? He'll learn you the machines, and then you can take over while he have his holiday. He's got 3 weeks to do it." All right, that's fair enough. And I went in there, and I done this cow herd and come through just as well as the other man. So I just show you can do any job if you set your mind to it. And I remember my brother, he was a yardman, they called him, stock feeder. And one morning that was the start of the lambing season. And they went and found the shepherd collapsed in the shepherd's hut. They took him home and Bob said, oh dear, what am I going to do now? Who am I going to put along the sheep? He said, you'll have to take Harry out of the yard and send him along the sheep. He went and took this flock of sheep, brought them through the lambing all right. And he was a shepherd then all the rest of his life. And I remember him during the war. He was lying out. He had two drunken Americans went to his hut. They said, we're coming in, buddy, we'll dash down in here tonight. He said, I know you won't. You aren't coming in here. Well, he had a sheepdog called Moss. He said, put them out here, Moss. He didn't want no second telling. He soon shifted them, they cleared off. They didn't stop there along him. One night he went out to his lamb yard, and he left his hut door ajar with the light showing out. He thinks that's what caused it. Of course, there was a German bomber come over, and they come down low and fired on his hut as they went over. And he lay down, lucky for him, he lay down in the lamb yard. So he got through that all right. Well then, of course, things began to happen on the farms. More machines were brought in. I knew horses were going out, but I didn't think they'd went out completely like they have done. Tractors were coming in. Of course, there was less men wanted. And I found myself unemployed. I was 54. I'd never been unemployed in my life. And I booked up here to there and went in a factory. I asked for a job. Well, at 54, they looked at you as though you were an old age pension. But anyhow, the governor come through, and the manager said to him, there's a chap here for a job, he said. Oh, he said, what have you been doing? Well, I said, I might as well tell you, I've been on the land all my life. Oh, he said, well, I think there's a job you can do. I never mind setting a farm man on, because they learnt you how to work on a farm. Well, that was the truest words he ever spoke, because if you was on a farm them days, you either had to work or starve. There was nothing else for you. I think the tradesmen, like building workers and that, they got the doors, but there was no door for farm workers. And I can remember Gating Union, when if a woman was left, say her husband left her with a family, she'd have nothing. The only opening for her was to go into Gating Union or Gressenhall Union. Same with what they call today one-parent families. Well, if a young woman had a child, she'd be almost kicked out of the village. She'd end up in the union. But thank goodness that's all finished. And things are better. But them days, we never went short of grub. We always had plenty of grub. And I remember my mother, on a Friday, the butcher'd come round, 5 pound joint of beef. That was our weekend joint. Well, then all through the week she'd buy pork chops, sausages, lump pork. You'd ask, well, you wouldn't go to work. If a man went to work with cheese and jam, he was reckoned very poor. I'll tell you another tale about that. We was sugar beaten, and we all used to have meat packed up, cut it off with a knife. One old boy, he always had bread and jam. Jack said, I'll have a game along then. When I went looking, he changed our dinner bags over. When I come to dinner time, this one, what he said? Posy, old gal, there'll be a hell up when I get home. And now, today, cheese and jam, well, they're expensive items. But bread and cheese, that was the tramps' food. They'd have that, bread and cheese, and shop-bought cakes, and buns, and them sort of things. Well, and one go work with them in his bag. They call them fallows. I remember the little fellow one day opened his dinner bag. He was freshly married. And he opened his dinner bag. He had a lot of shop-bought cakes and tarts in his bag. And said, you let alone your wife's different to that, Walter, he said. You can't work on fallows. He said, yeah, that's a different growth to that. And so you did. You always had plenty of growth. But now, well, I don't know the sort of grub we laughed at or wouldn't look at. Well, they are expensive items now. Cheese and jam. And I mean, during the war, everything, all the land, every acre of land they could plough up, they ploughed up for food. But now, they're growing too much. If, with all the surpluses they got, the grub should be cheaper. But no, they've got to keep the price up, and therefore they don't want to produce so much. But if they produced it, you should be able to have it cheaper. But no, that ain't the case. But then that's coming into politics. No, I don't know nothing about politics, so we'll let that alone. And I tell you, for the last 10 years of my working life, I went into a factory, but that was murder. All the noise and being shut in, that was murder in there, but I stuck it, and I got through right up till I retired. And now I suppose, well, what I do now, I do my garden, I keep a few rabbits. That keep me occupied. But thinking back, I had arthritis. And the surgeon, when I went into hospital to have some hip joints fitted, the surgeon said, well, what kind of work did you do? Well, thinking back, with all the heavy lifting and carrying we used to do, and all the wet and all the mud, you can't wonder that I saw men had arthritis. I think I had my feet in the mud too long.